Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Pulse of Podcast, Pew Research Center's event on the state of podcasting in the U.S. We have an incredible panel today and a really great audience from all sides of the media world. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Katie Thornton, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. I'll introduce you to the panelists shortly, but just to begin, here's how today's going to go. Right after I introduce the panel, we'll be hearing from Matsa at Pew, who led the recent study. She'll be going over key findings. We'll follow that with our panel discussion, and then we will be having about 15 minutes for question and answers before we wrap up. That said, you do not need to wait until the Q&A to engage with us. Please send us your questions and comments throughout the event. On the right side of your screen, there's a little chat feed, so please enter your comments and your questions in there. The fantastic folks at Pew will be going through the conversation and fielding questions our way. So please react, respond, ask questions. We want you to shape this panel too. We have an incredible group of folks watching today, such a varied audience with all sorts of knowledge, and I imagine all sorts of great questions as well. So please ask away. And without further ado, we're going to move on to some introductions of our panel. First, we have Lizzie Breyer Bowman. Lizzie Breyer Bowman is the VP of Growth and Marketing at Lemonada Media, a fast-growing woman-led startup with the mission to make life suck less. There, Lizzie leads the marketing function for the full slate of nearly 40 podcasts. Lizzie previously served as Managing Director for National Marketing and Marketing Capabilities at American Public Media. She was an independent marketing consultant focused on brand management and marketing at General Mills, and worked in journalism at the New York Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She holds an MBA from the University of Virginia and a BA in journalism from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Next up, we have Michael Harriot. Michael is a writer at theGrio, a contributing columnist at The Guardian, an Emmy-nominated staff writer for Peacock's The Amber Ruffin Show, and the creator of Drapetomaniax, Unshackled History. He is the winner of the 2019 National Association of Black Journalists Award for Daily Commentary, as well as Public Affairs programs, the 2021 NABJ Award for Magazine Reporting, and the recipient of New York Association for Black Journalists Trailblazer Award. His second book, Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America, will be released in September. Next, we have Elahe Izadi. She co-hosts the daily flagship podcast, Post Reports, and is also a reporter covering media at the Washington Post. She joined the Post in 2014 as a general assignment reporter, and in 2016 joined the style section as pop culture writer. She's previously covered Congress, demographics, local news, and worked for National Journal, WAMU 88.5, TBD.com, and the Gazette community newspapers. We also have Katerina Matsa. She is the Director of News and Information Research at Pew Research Center, where she specializes in news habits and attitudes in the US and Europe. She's an expert on the impact of technology and politics on the news and information environment, and the use of technology, the use of multiple research methodologies. Kat did graduate work in the Communications Doctoral Program at American University. She holds an MSc in Politics and Government in the European Union from the London School of Economics, and an MA in Communication from Georgetown University, and received her BA in Political Science in Athens, Greece. And we also have Bridget Todd. Bridget Todd is a frequently cited expert, trainer, and speaker on combating disinformation and extremism online, advocating for social media platform accountability, creating safer spaces for women and other marginalized people online, and celebrating and amplifying marginalized people's contributions to tech and the internet. Bridget is the creator of the critically acclaimed podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet, which earned Best Technology Podcast at the iHeartRadio Podcast Awards. She also earned a Shorty Award for Best Podcast Miniseries for Disinformed, a series that explores how misinformation and conspiracy theories around COVID, gender, and race hurt marginalized communities. Bridget is the Director of Communication for the National Gender Justice Advocacy Organization, Ultraviolet. Her writing and work on technology, race, and gender and culture have been featured in The Atlantic, Newsweek, The Nation, The Daily Show, and several other outlets. My name's Katie Thornton. I'm a freelance journalist, podcast producer, and writer. Recently reported and hosted the Peabody-winning podcast series, The Divided Dial, through WNYC's On the Media. The series looks at the ongoing influence of another audio format, talk radio. I'm also a repeat producer at 99% Invisible and have written for outlets like The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. And I am so excited to be able to moderate this conversation. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for joining us. This is a heavy-hitting panel, and I'm sure it's going to be a really great discussion. And it comes at the perfect time because, as we all know, this is a time of massive change in the podcast world. And sometimes as reporters or producers or executives and researchers, it's easy to forget the big picture. That people want podcasts. They want to learn, they want to listen, to be entertained. There's demand for all sorts of podcasts, from politics and entertainment to self-help and true crime. And the fact that there's a demand for what we do gives us a special responsibility. We are truly privileged to be able to answer that call. And for executives and reporters alike, this is a crucial time to be able to understand what choices listeners are making with the options available to them, to understand people's motivations for listening, what genres and topics and formats are getting them excited, and also to understand how podcasts are funded and the key characteristics of top-ranked podcasts and what the future might look like for the medium. Thankfully, Pew's recent study has parsed this wonderfully for us, and that's what we're all here to talk about today. So I'm going to hand it over to Kat Matsa from Pew, who will be sharing some of the key findings from the Pew Research study.
Thank you, Katie. I'm so excited as well to be here and share so much data we have on podcasts. So for those that you don't know the center, Pew Research Center is a research organization that we are non-advocacy and non-partisan organization, and we use a lot of different methodologies and basically explore a wide range of topics, from politics to US media and news and information to religion. And we employ a range of methodologies. We are using surveys, content analyses, analysis of demographic data, a lot of this, and like trying to combine everything to get a full picture. So our main funder, we're a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust, and we basically managed to do this work as well because of the generous support of the Knight Foundation. So diving right into our work and getting some data there, basically we took few months, actually more maybe than a few months, to look at the podcast environment. So we basically did a survey component of this work where we wanted to understand people's experiences and habits with podcasts. And then we also looked at the top ranked podcasts, 451 actually is the number. And our goal there was to also look at the content, right? The different formats, what the topics are, etc. So here are some key takeaways from all that work that we had been releasing in stages the past 2 months. One, as Katie mentioned, podcasts are popular. We have seen the rise in listening in the past 10 years. That continues to be the case. The second big takeaway is that it's a space that there's a lot of variety. Lots of different topics, producers, and different formats. The third takeaway is that podcasts can be a social activity. And one of the things that we've seen in a lot of the questions that we ask is that people are talking, they're discussing what they've heard in podcasts, and it's creating that kind of like socialization element among Americans. The fourth element, which is very important to us, and we wanted to kind of like dig deeper and kind of like understand further, is news and what role news is playing in the podcasting world. And one of the things that we saw is that people are encountering news, but it's not the main focus of the podcasting landscape. Lastly, as you'll see in some of the last slides, I did want to share some information on the demographics of the listeners, and we've seen a lot of differences in the topics that they choose to listen to and who is listening in terms of like the frequency that they do. So let me start with basically how people are using podcasts and how they're engaging with that. So first, as I said, a large share of the US public actually has listened to a podcast here, about 50%, about half have listened to a podcast in the past 12 months. And the main reasons that they told us that they do that is because of entertainment. They want something to learn, but also, interestingly, diversion. They are listening to a podcast because they want to do while they're doing something else. As I said, the environment of podcasting is a very diverse environment with a lot of choice. And we see that in the topics as well. As you see here, about a quarter of the topics, about a quarter of the podcasts that we studied, the topic is true crime. But the interesting part of this graphic and that data is that there's a lot of different topics. And we saw that from the public side when we asked actually about topics, and we are seeing it here also from the top 451 podcasts that we studied. No topic was more, there was a dominant one, right? You're seeing a range of different topics. And that range comes through also when we asked people an open-ended question to name a podcast that they're listening the most. And out of those that they gave us an answer, there is no one podcast that it's being named more than 5% of the public. And the list that we saw, it's a very long and diverse list of choices. Choices also come into the form of production. So looking at where these podcasts are affiliated, who are they affiliated with in terms of organizations and being independent. As you see here, independent organizations, they are focusing on podcasting, and news organizations at the same time, 18% are actually affiliated with a news organization. And then we're having other types of organizations that they're not news organizations, basically being the producers of podcasts. At the same time, when we're looking at formats, one of the things that we saw is that there isn't one type of format. Like, let's say in all of these podcasts, we didn't see like interviewing was the most, common. We saw interviewing, we saw deep dives being also very popular. So lots of different formats in terms of like how these podcasts are portraying, are being basically produced to the public. As I said in the beginning, one of the other big takeaways is that podcasts can be a social activity. And as you see here, large shares of the public and podcast listeners specifically, they are recommending podcasts to someone else. They're actually listening to podcasts that has been recommended to them. And they're also discussing it, right? They're discussing things that they've heard on a podcast with others. The other here little nugget of data that I thought is really interesting speaks to change. We did see that about a third of podcast listeners actually have made a lifestyle change based on something that they heard on a podcast. Moving on a bit, like doing a bit of a deep dive on news and podcasts, which I think it's like an interesting thing, and we have great panelists to actually speak on the role of news in podcasting today. One of the things that we saw is that while Americans are telling us that they encounter news very frequently, as you see, 67% are encountering news discussions in the podcasts that they're listening, it's not the solely focus of podcasting. So when we are looking at the top ranked podcasts and whether news is a focus, the sole focus of those podcasts, 15% of those are news focused. And a lot of that is focusing on politics and sports. The other element that it makes this group of podcasts different than other podcasts is the fact that they are very much structured around commentary. That's another thing that we are seeing in terms of the differences between news focus and other types of podcasts. Another, in terms of like the positive element and like what in terms of the experience that people are enjoying in a way, or they seem to be having a positive experience there, is the fact that they're expecting the news they see there to be mostly accurate. You see, this is a very high number of 87%. And also there is some trust in that, in what they're saying. And you see here that there is a 31% where they trust the news that they hear on podcasts more than they do from other sources. And that is actually an interesting data point, because comparatively, we've asked similar questions, for instance, on social media, and those numbers are much lower. So there is, our data indicate that there is a wider trust and expectation of accuracy in this space. As in some of our other work has shown, there is a bit of a difference between Republicans and Democrats. One of the things that we saw, there aren't differences actually in how often or whether they're listening to a podcast, but the expectation of accuracy and the uniqueness of the podcast that they hear there, the opinions that they hear there. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to trust the news that they encounter on podcasts. And also they say that the news that they hear there, they wouldn't have heard them elsewhere. Finally, some data on demographics, because we have seen some of the differences. Again, we didn't see a lot of difference in terms of like the intensity when it comes to some of the groups. But when it comes to whether people have listened, along with other spaces that we saw on the digital space, like social media and getting news from news organizations, younger people are more likely to have listened to a podcast. So that was not a big surprise. However, one of the things that we saw is that in true crime, for instance, like we did a deep dive on true crime as a topic, and we released a short report yesterday. We did see big differences by gender and education. And here you see how gender comes into play, especially, and it's consistent across educational levels. However, women basically are more likely to have listened to a true crime podcast than men. Finally, when we're looking at race and ethnicity as groups and how that plays into podcasting, we didn't see many differences in how often or whether these groups, if they have listened to a podcast, or like if there is a difference there, but we did see differences in reasons and the topics that they listen to. So here, as you see, Black US podcast listeners are more likely to choose topics that they focus on race and ethnicity and on self-help and relationships. So a lot of difference here in terms of how Black podcasters, podcast listeners are choosing different topics versus others and compared with other groups. And with that, I tried to brush through all of our data in a very fast way. And I'm really interested to hear, get our data into life, right, with this amazing panel. And I'm going to turn it now to all of us.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that research, Kat. That is just phenomenal. There is more to the study, so please check it out. We're just going to dive right into the panel discussion. To sort of kick it off, as we've seen, podcasts are in demand. They're reaching a lot of people with a lot of different types of reporting and material. But we also know that there have been a lot of conversations about a podcast bubble or even a bust. We'll definitely talk more about sustainability in a little bit. But I wanted to start by asking the panelists, as producers and executives and researchers yourself, what are you seeing right now that's working well? What are you most excited about in the podcasting universe?
Yeah, if you would like, I could start off. I co-host the Daily News podcast at the Washington Post, and some things that I find particularly encouraging, and I think it's backed up by some of the research we just saw, is this question around trust. I think there's been a lot of conversation in the past several years about trust in news media and whether audiences are really able to find credible sources of information. And the podcast Post Reports for us, and also the 7, which is the daily news briefing that we have, it's a way for the audience to develop a relationship with the Post and also understand how and what goes into reporting. It's one thing to read an article and, sort of digest the information, but when you get to hear the reporter unpack what they've discovered and have someone, a host who you've developed a relationship with over time as a listener, ask them probing questions about how it is they exactly got to their reporting, I think that develops a different type of trust. The other really encouraging thing that we've discovered, and I think also, is shown in the data that was just presented, is we're reaching younger people. When we talk about news media and other formats, whether it's online, if you're looking at subscribers, cable news, a lot of media companies are struggling to reach a younger audience, and younger audiences in the US are also more racially diverse. And the fact that our listeners, the majority of whom are under 45, and also we're just seeing the data overall in the podcast industry, I think it's exciting that younger people are already going to this space to get information. And, it's on us to provide the credible information. And I think both of those things are really exciting. And, it's a way for us to really develop a strong relationship with our audiences. And that persists over time into a daily habit.
I have to echo that. I was going to say the exact same thing. The thing that really excites me about the podcast space right now really is that trust. I think, particularly younger listeners, audiences of color, I think we're at a time where we've seen record feelings of mistrust and distrust when it comes to mainstream media. And I always say, I don't blame these audiences who for years have not seen themselves meaningfully and thoughtfully depicted in media. So of course, those people who time and time again just see themselves in a way that they don't even recognize are going to check out or going to disengage. And so I think that trust is a huge opportunity to rebuild some of that relationship between audiences and folks who make media. I do find that, you can really use that trust to combat things like inaccurate information or mis or disinformation, because people really do have a different kind of relationship with the podcast host that, they know their name, they think of them by their first name, they have that intimate relationship with that host in their ears. I often hear from podcast listeners that they listen to podcasts in their headphones while they're going to sleep, or it's the first thing they listen to when they get up in the morning. And so really being able to use that trust to build an authentic and meaningful relationship between media maker and audience, I think is just a super exciting thing happening in the space right now. So I definitely agree.
I'd love to build off of that too. I think that it's dead on, this idea of the intimacy that's created between the host and the listener. And I think it's allowed for some really interesting storytelling to come out in the last couple of years. And there are a couple of things I'd point to. I think there's really been a demand and an interest for more ethical true crime. Some of the new stats that Kat just shared with us about that huge dominance of true crime in the space, we're starting to see people wanting true crime that's told with real soul and spirit, that's not exploiting people, that's not just sort of reveling in that crime. So you're seeing things like In the Dark from APM moving over and being picked up by Condé Nast. You're seeing Bone Valley from Lava for Good, which was just amazing. We recently at Lemonada put out a series called Blind Plea that's been doing very well for us, that's looking at domestic violence and how that can turn into really difficult conversations in the justice system. I think that kind of true crime reporting has become really important for people because they are looking for that kind of intimate relationship and they don't want to feel sort of dragged down into the muck when they're having that kind of relationship with a podcast. And I also think it's led to this kind of, I'll call it empathy building storytelling that is so, so critical and so unique to this medium, where you really get the chance to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. I mean, you see that all over the place. You see it with things like Terrible Thanks for Asking. You see it with the beautiful work of Welcome to Provincetown, where you feel like you're just in Provincetown with Mitra. We have an audio reality studio at Lemonada where we did Being Trans and Being Golden, and we were able to sort of immerse in the lives of people who may have never met someone who's trans or may not spend a lot of time with people who are elderly. And I think that chance to get inside someone else's head and live in their life a little bit is something that's very unique to the podcast medium. And I think as people want to build that one-to-one relationship with the podcast they're listening to. It really is something that audiences are looking for more and more.
I think when you look at the data and compare it, so I started like my first podcast in 2011. I always joke and say I started it before Black people were listening to podcasts. And like the idea, when you look at that data about, like Black people, Black listeners listening to podcasts that deal with race and ethnicity, one of the things I kind of would like to dismantle with the data and sometimes with what you see in podcasting is like all podcasts are based or focused on race and identity, like the podcasts that are done by white people that comes from a different viewpoint than Black listeners listen to. So the Black podcasts are not just about race and identity. But the interesting thing in it, what we see with these podcasts, right, is the ability and the opportunity to give the creators, we talk about the audiences, but, there was a barrier in media since it began, right? The cost barrier, the access barrier, where the creators, the people who wrote, people who produced, people who made content were disconnected from the audience just from the barrier of cost mostly. And what podcasts do is give those creators a chance not just to connect with the audience, right? But audiences a chance to get like unfiltered content. So if you're Black, you're hearing from a Black perspective from people who have your ideas. It's not just a Black podcast. It's you might be a Black conservative. You might be a Black person who's really into sports. You might be a Black person who's really into true crime. And those subtle fractured differences in what you listen to and what you enjoy are offered in any form. And I think that barrier that has been eliminated between the creators and the people who are interested in things is really exciting.
Yeah, and I'd love to add to that. So often in media, we're being told, particularly audiences who are traditionally marginalized, we're being told that we couldn't possibly be unbiased about a story that affects us. And so I've been told that time and time again that, if you're a Black person, you couldn't possibly, in an unbiased way, report on a story that is about your identity as a Black person. And we've known for so long that that is just completely not true. And I think podcasting is a way where we can hear from folks at the center of these experiences. And that it kind of reinforces the idea that your experience is valid, and it's okay if you want to say that you are the expert and the authority of the experience that you're having. I think podcasting is responsible for a broader shift in media, that it's okay to hear from somebody who shares the experience that they're reporting on.
Yeah, and I wanted to, and I didn't share that data, but I think as I hear everyone, it brings it even more to my mind, is that connection, right? We talked about that connection, and we did see in the data two ways. One is the connection to the host. So we did see where about a quarter of those that they named a podcast in that open-ended question that I showed actually feel at least very connected to the host. And the other element is that the production and what Michael was just saying in terms of like how you are creating a podcast. And one of the things that we did see from the content side, we did look at the finances and the ownership, right, of those and of the podcasts. And what we saw is that there is a high percentage of those podcasts that they are asking people for support. They're asking their audience in many different ways, right, to support their work. So there is this, I would say, two ways, right? Like where people are saying that they feel connected, like a sizable share, and podcast creators asking for that support to be able to continue that work.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And thanks everybody for your really incredible perspectives. And I think it really is true, this point about accessibility, being able to produce stories, to be able to tell stories, and for people being able to see themselves reflected a little bit more in the media ecosystem. Thanks so much for that input. And Kat just sort of mentioned at the end there, these funding models. And so there's a lot of conversation right now, as a lot of people may be aware, about how to keep podcasts sustainable. And I'm wondering if folks want to talk a little bit more, were you surprised to hear that half of podcasts are sort of calling for support from their listeners. What are funding models that you have seen work? And if you're an executive, what have you seen work? And if you're a producer, what sort of words of advice or recommendations would you have for executives?
So I think, so I've been, again, from independent podcasts to my day job is my podcast is funded by a news media organization, theGrio, and then, working with Sony on Drapetomaniax. So I've seen all kinds of funding models, but I think what's interesting about these funding models is like the idea that when we say self-sustaining, are we talking about sustaining the production of a podcast, or is the podcast a complementary part of something else, right? Like, is it a complementary part of the news organization where the advertising revenue, it just goes into a big pot that helps the news organization? Are you funding a specific host income? Or is, for instance, we see the comedy podcast, right, that build audiences that might not provide the revenue for the comedian, but it helps them build an audience and become, a better funded in his profession. So there are all kinds of funding options, and you have to think about, what are you talking about when you talk about funding? Are we talking about the funding of the production, sustaining the production, or are you talking about being part of a bigger and larger machine where the podcast is a complementary source, just like, for instance, the printing press and the newspaper, or the advertising room, the advertising budget at a TV station? And I think those are the things that we have to think about when we think about funding models.
Yeah, if I could jump in there too, in addition to co-hosting Post Reports, I also cover the media industry. And this is a question that I'm often, presented with. And you could look at any sort of media format, whether it's television, whether it's, the website for a newspaper or a digital news organization, that, obviously if your numbers are up in the audience, that means that you're really successful, right? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we saw during the first few months of the coronavirus pandemic, advertising revenue across media dropped off, even though viewership, listenership, all sorts of ships were at record highs, because people were really craving news and information, but you had this sort of distorted mismatch with the advertising space. And I love what Michael said about how you really have to look at what the role of a particular podcast is, especially if it's housed within a bigger media company. Is the role of that podcast to develop a relationship, play a long game, where you're bringing in people who are not already interacting with that company's products and its journalism, for instance, and you're bringing in new audience, and that over time, these will be people that will increasingly be paying for subscriptions and that sort of thing? Or is it, a space that fundamentally is bringing in a lot of, in public media, underwriting, that people are basically paying money to put ads on that podcast? Is it self-sustaining? I mean, you really have to look in a dynamic way as to what the role is for each of these podcasts, but it's undeniable that across the industry, listenership is growing. So, we talk about the podcast bubble. You could also look at digital media bubble has burst and has been reborn several iterations over. Podcasting is still a pretty new media industry, if you think about it. And so people are sort of struggling to find out what's the financial model that really works. But if there is an audience that craves this, it's really a question of, okay, how are we going to position it? And what is the strategy for this particular podcast? I mean, if you look at, for instance, at a news organization, you are going to do stories that are important and that need to be done, and that you don't expect a lot of people to consume. And that's okay, because you have other things within your mix of content that you're creating that maybe aren't viewed as important, but have a huge audience. And that has been the model since, newspapers started putting things on the front page, photos of kids going to school and that sort of thing. It supplements, it complements. And so to just look at one podcast and ask, is it generating tons of money for whatever institution is, might not be the right question.
I'm feeling I could not be nodding any harder at what you just said. And I have a kind of a unique experience. My podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet, it is on a big podcast company called iHeartRadio. And so I think of myself as sort of a little fish within a huge pond. And my podcast is about technology, but about technology, looking at it from a perspective of people who are traditionally marginalized and left out of conversations around tech, right? So women, queer folks, trans folks, folks of color. The topic can be a little bit niche, so I will probably never have the same amount of listeners as Joe Rogan, God don't I wish, but the people who come to my podcast come because it makes them feel seen and centered, right? And so even though I might not have millions and millions and millions of downloads of listeners, the listeners I do have are very engaged, right? They're very active. We're very connected. We really have built that trust relationship. And so that to me is worth more than having a bazillion listeners who are just kind of meh engaged, right? And so some of the advice I get, especially, or some of the questions I get, especially right now, are from folks who are like, gee, there are so many podcasts. It seems like the money is drying up. Is it worth starting a podcast? And I always say it absolutely is worth it. If you have something to say, put it out there. But the way that you are compensated for that work might not look like what you're expecting or what you're hoping. So have an open mind about what compensation actually looks like. Maybe you're not getting actual money for making the show, but it's generating leads for a business that you have, or it's raising your profile in another way. Another thing I'd like to say is if folks are looking for advice about how you navigate this sort of weird time in the industry in terms of funding and compensation, one thing I have found is if you are someone who thinks of yourself as like a little fish in a big pond, try to keep your team nimble. Like try to, see how lean you can build your team that actually like make your show so that you're not, your team doesn't feel so bloated that it costs so much to sort of get something out there. And another thing I would say is really get creative about where you seek funding. As Michael said, there's so many different ways to get compensation in the space. Maybe it's not going to be you being signed to a big podcast company, but maybe a foundation would want to give you a grant to make your podcast. Maybe a values-aligned brand might want to sponsor your podcast, right? Honestly, you never know. So I guess all of that is to say, still start a podcast. Do not be dismayed by all of this sort of doom and gloom reporting that the space is falling apart. I don't believe that. I have not seen that. And if you've got something to say, it is still worth it to put it out there.
The world would be better if you had as many downloads as Joe Rogan, Bridget. It really would.
Let him know.
But I think it would. And I think that what we all have the opportunity to do as an industry is educate advertisers about what you just talked about, which is that relationship that we were all talking about before that hosts have with their listeners and how incredibly valuable that is for an advertiser. I think that we are at this turning point with advertisers where we could start to bring in big brands. I come from consumer products. I worked at big brands like General Mills. And right now, they are not spending a ton of money in the podcast space. It would be such a game changer if we could bring more of those brands to the table. Right now, most of the advertisers in the podcast space are direct to consumer brands. So, the joke is Casper mattresses, right? Like those kind of brands. And it's because it's very easy for them to measure the impact of what they're spending. They can get a code and say, okay, I bought on Bridget's podcast and this many people used the code and bought my mattress and I know exactly what the ROI for my spend was. It's a little harder to measure if you're buying on, cereal and because you heard about it on a podcast, it's a little harder to get that direct relationship measured. And this is where the data, so we love Pew and all of our friends like Pew, that data is so, so, so important to make the case. And this isn't something that any one podcast can do alone. Like we as an industry all have to start helping educate these big companies to come to the table with their big media budgets and start even just experimenting. Like, man, I would take 1% of the media budget from any of these big companies and show them, hey, we built such a strong relationship with our listeners that every single one of them who heard the ad went out and bought your product. Isn't that worth it? Even if it seems like a higher CPM than these super, super efficient TV ads that you're reaching a lot of people, but it's totally background noise and it's not really doing anything. I think that efficiency versus effectiveness conversation really needs to happen in a different way. And I think we as an industry have that opportunity to educate new and different advertisers to come to the table. And that's how we will keep new money flowing in and keep the industry afloat as things just continue to change on a business perspective. We may have maxed out with some of the advertisers we currently have, but that doesn't mean that we can't bring new ones in.
Yeah, I just want to add on both sides of that conversation, right? One of the most valuable things you have as a podcaster is data, right? Like advertisers want data to micro target audiences either that they're missing or the audience that they want, right? So we have that because we're on the internet. And the other thing is that the most valuable thing I think that podcasters can do is if you can build a dedicated audience, right? There'll be a way to monetize it. It's up to you to find a way to monetize it. But if you can build a dedicated audience who is interested and trust you, then it might be a sticker, it might be a t-shirt, it might be a live show, it might be a tour, it might be a book, but there will be an opportunity, and those people who trust you will tell you and sometimes let you know what that opportunity is. You should write a book. Oh, you should talk more about this. I love a t-shirt with this on it. I'd love to have you in my city. Those are the opportunities that you have. And I think if you just focus on building that audience and using your voice to coalesce the people who are interested in your topic, then the opportunity will present itself for funding.
We're sort of returning to this idea of relationship building and trust. And I'm thinking about the fact that, 80% of Americans who said they listen to news on podcasts say they expect the information they hear to be mostly accurate. We talked a lot about those personal relationships, about the trust that listeners have with the hosts. And we had some really great questions in the chat about how the sort of accessibility of creating podcasts, the lower barrier to entry, and that trust is such an enormous strength of the medium. But it was also brought up that it feels like then there's room for misinformation and disinformation to spread, given that there is this sort of trust. As the question asked, some podcasts are being responsible, many are fact checking, many are not. How do we sort of square that with the data about the trust in podcasts? And what are the sort of pros and the cons of that trust?
Yeah, if I could start off, if that's all right. When I saw that slide about trust, one question that arose for me is whether there is an audience and group of people who are actively seeking out alternative voices outside of what's considered, quote unquote, the mainstream, precisely because they distrust those other sources of information. And then when we combine it with what we're talking about earlier about how wonderful and beautiful it is that people and audiences develop these close relationships with these individuals who are hosting. I mean, that could also be a recipe for disaster if the host is, presenting things that are just plain wrong, and if they're not part of some other big media institution that has rigorous standards. So that is something to think about, but it's also, what we see perhaps on talk radio. AM talk radio is also a source for a lot of commentary, and get the previous data slide that it was talking about how much of the top podcasts are commentary based, but yet people are getting their news from these sources. So that was really interesting to me, that if people are not seeking out news, but they are saying they are getting news from sources of commentary, what are the rigorous standards in place on those commentary platforms to make sure what they are commenting on, the basis of which they're commenting on is actually true. And I know that misinformation, there's been so much research done into how, insidious it can be. So it's, we were talking about how beautiful the opportunity is, but here's the flip side of that as well. And, we've seen in recent years, platforms like Spotify come under fire for hosting certain personalities that have aired things that are false or inflammatory. And that raises a question as to whether some of these bigger platforms bear any responsibility for the content on their platforms. I mean, that's the same conversation that was taking place around Meta, for instance, formerly Facebook. So I think that's a really important point to bring up. And that's the flip side of the trust conversation, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think,
please.
I was just going to say that I think the oxymoron is like, it's inherent in all media, right? Like if you are into UFOs, you're not going to listen to the podcast that debunks everything is, that was a shadow in the sky, or that was a light, or that was a lightning bug, right? Like the people tend to gravitate toward the echo chamber for which confirms their whatever they think, right? And so I don't think podcasts are any different than websites or AM radio or anything else, right? Like, I think we have to be rigorous about making sure that we fact check and validate all of our sources, but I don't think that we should have to necessarily put a burden on podcasts that doesn't exist in all of the other mediums, because like you could go to a website and read about the aliens that attacked last night, or you could read a book about it or a TV show. Like, so, that phenomenon exists in all of media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely found that phenomenon exists everywhere. But I do think it's like particular in podcasting. I don't think it's worse in podcasting necessarily. In my day job, I do a lot of research on how to combat mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories online. One thing that researchers have seen time and time again is that there is a specific difficulty with finding mis and disinformation in podcasting because, one, it's an audio medium. And so like there's lots of models that can scrape written content and say, oh, that's not true. That's against our terms of service if you're on a social media platform, and flag it. Audio is a little bit different. We don't really have models that can do that as effectively. Also, the same thing that we were all sort of excited about earlier, the intimacy of the medium, that also makes it a little bit tough to find people who are saying things that are not accurate in podcasting, right? It's not like reading a book on the subway where everybody can see what book you're reading because you're holding it in your hand. What podcast you listen to is between you and your phone and your headphones and nobody else, right? So you could be out there listening to some incendiary podcasts and people might be very surprised to find out what podcast you're actually listening to. And so there are a couple of things that I have found that make podcasting unique in terms of being a vector for mis and disinformation. But I think everybody here on the panel would probably agree that that doesn't mean that as podcasters, we don't have a responsibility, just like anybody who's making any kind of public media, to get things right? Like I make my podcast in my kitchen, pretty much just me. It's a dog and pony show, yet I can take the time to fact check. I can take the time to like make sure I'm reporting things that are correct. It really, it's a real problem when huge names in podcasting, right? People who take up a lot of space in the conversation say things like, oh, well, I'm just a comedian. Like, I don't really know what I'm saying. Like, I don't need to, like, how could I fact check? And the reality is if you're making millions of dollars a year for your podcast, you can fact check, right? You can do some baseline editorial standards before you put this content out to millions of people. It's one thing when you're having like a lighthearted conversation about something like, oh, is it true that orcas are, attacking yachts and rich people? And I think it's a conspiracy theory. There's a difference between that and saying the COVID vaccine doesn't work, or, saying something that is truly, truly harmful, particularly to people who are marginalized. And so I think that people who are making podcasts, just like any other kind of media, definitely have a responsibility to be putting out ethical, fact-checked, accurate content, and anybody who tells you that they can't do it or that responsibility is not a burden that they should have to bear is just not correct. I could say some specific names, but I will not.
Yeah, I was like,
yeah, and jumping in here, I know there's a lot of misinformation research, as everyone has pointed to, and we've done a lot of work on that front. We didn't do it actually in this specific study in terms of like actually trying to track misinformation and how prevalent that is. A lot of the challenges we've had with even other mediums, right, that they have written speech that is, frankly, from the research side, easier than audio, is the fact that even tracking what misinformation is and what also cuts through that broad ceiling, right? And it's not something that it is in the deep, dark side of the web, right? Like that people would know about it, that we can ask about it, but also like that can be detected, right? That's the other challenge there. There's so many different pieces of misinformation that can be out there. And we've seen that challenge with our work. We've, studied misinformation on different social media platforms, and that has been always and we've asked about it, right? And even when we're asking about it, it's difficult. It's difficult in terms of like identifying it and making sure we can ask something that people would be able to respond to. So I think that speaks like in terms of like give a bit of context, there is definitely in our work, we've seen a dissatisfaction with the larger, more established news media organizations, right? Where study after study, we are seeing kind of a common theme from our data where people are seeking for alternative places, alternative to what they have been experiencing up until now, where they can have, they can find community, they can find people that they can relate to. They can also, in this study, as we saw, and I mentioned, like a host and feel connected to that host and trust that information more than other places. So there is a bit of a, I think, connecting thread here in terms of like how people are assessing the news media environment. And I'm interested to see where that will take us.
Thank you all for that input. And in a way, it sort of gets back to our earlier question about advertising, because as was noted, fact checking does take time and it does cost money. And I wanted to field another question from the audience that we've sort of been talking about indirectly, and I just want to pose it directly. How is podcasting sort of managing this intersection between storytelling and personality-driven sort of talk entertainment and journalism? I think a lot of organizations are used to being a strictly news outlet, or they're used to being a strictly entertainment outlet. How are podcast hosts and podcast companies managing that? And they're also wondering, how do you navigate that with advertising partners?
Well, I can speak, co-hosting a daily news podcast at a news organization that is already very well established. I co-host it with Martine Powers. And then we also have Jeff Pierre, who hosts The Seven, which is our daily news briefing. And, we as hosts are unafraid to bring ourselves out and to feel, for lack of a better way of putting it, to be human when talking about the news. And I think, for myself, when I'm hosting, I'm thinking about how I'm really, in some ways, a stand-in for the audience that's listening, or a conduit, or, if someone says something that is wild, like, I should react as a human, as me, as Elahe, my personality, react to what they just said being wild. Because if you're at home listening, or you're in the car, you're on a walk, and you hear this, you might also feel that way. And so, we like to think of ourselves, and, for me, I like to think of myself as, it's important for me to be human. And a lot of what we talk about on the show, it ranges. It could be something that's really difficult, really challenging. We might be covering the pullout in Afghanistan. We might be covering, something like the debt ceiling. We might be covering all these things, but we also did an episode about friendship and why friendship is really important and good for your health. And I think, we like to bring our humanity out in those stories, while also, when it is appropriate, hold powerful people and institutions accountable, and do that on our show as well. And I think that's sort of an approach that you can hear on the podcast that maybe when you're reading a story or you're reading an investigation, you're not going to get that same experience. So that's one thing I'll just say on that front. And on the advertising piece, I mean, when you're within a news organization, there's already a very strict firewall between the business ad side and the content that you're generating. I know podcasts, that's a huge industry with all different types of setups, but that same firewall exists for our show. And so, those things are very distinct for us. So I'll say that from that perspective of being in this big news company.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different perspective because I sort of sit at the enterprise level, so I can look at the portfolio that we have across the whole network. And we have, nearly 40 shows across Lemonada. So we really do have a whole spectrum from pretty in-depth investigative shows that take, 10 months, a year to put together, and quite a lot of journalistic reporting, all the way to what might be considered more of a chat show, your traditional guy on a mic, two guys, usually two women when it's Lemonada on a mic. And so it really is quite a range, and they have different production models, they have different costs, and it's been nice for us to have that opportunity to manage it as a network, because they do really bring different types of listeners, different types of advertisers to the table as well, different sponsoring partners. Sometimes I would say that time horizon and the amount of time that goes into reporting the really in-depth journalistic work, I think, is one of the things that a lot of people don't realize. You can't just, people always say like, oh, well, I want the next serial. The serials of the world take a year or 2 years or 10 years or maybe never to come up with a story like that. And so I think that that is why it's very tempting to turn out a lot of these quick chat shows. They're relatively easy to produce. There's relatively a lower barrier to entry in terms of the actual back end reporting. That doesn't mean they're less valuable by any means, but I think having that mix of the two is good when you're a network, if you have the resources to do it. I think it's just being clear-eyed about how you balance those different needs when it comes to production, when it comes to cost, when it comes to the time. You have to balance your release schedule, all of those different things, just so that your expectations are aligned. And then I think you can really have the opportunity to bring both some good reporting. But I think the standards have to be the same for both. Going back to our previous question, like, we would never have a chat show that it doesn't have some degree of responsibility in terms of accuracy, just as we would expect that level of accuracy when we're doing more quote unquote journalistic reporting. We have a show within our portfolio, Last Day, that the first 3 seasons were very in-depth, reported on the ground, like one topic for 10 episodes narrative. And it has shifted this year to more of a weekly chat format. It's different. It allows our audience to step forward and tell their story, which is something that we had heard that they were interested in doing. We have probably gotten more letters and emails from audience members on that show than any other. People really have felt that their lives are changed by that show in some of the topics we've covered, like suicide and gun control and the opioid crisis. And so, like, letting people tell their own stories and centering them felt like a really nice evolution for the show. So even within a show, you can kind of have it both ways sometimes, which is really cool. But it's just a completely different production challenge. And I think people who don't work in the industry sometimes don't know how much of a difference there is in making those two different types of shows.
Yeah, I found the exact same thing that Lizzie has found. Someone once told me that when you're thinking of content, it can really be helpful to build that kind of variety into how you're thinking about it from the ground floor. And so, like, if you want to do like a 10 episode deep dive onto one topic, then make sure that you could also do like a chat version where you're responding to that more casually, and then maybe have a, monster of the week ongoing series that covers a different episode every week about a similar topic under that umbrella. Really being able to bake some of that variety into your strategy from the beginning and not being afraid to embrace it, right? Like, just because you started as an interview show doesn't mean you can't pivot to like doing deep dives within the same show or like a chattier show within that same brand. And so, yeah, just being able to listen to your audience, be nimble, pivot, and really, respond to what it is that your listeners are telling you that would resonate with them.
Yeah, and I think also, when we're talking about news, I think what podcasts offer the most value in is helping people, offering context, right, from different voices, different perspectives. If you're talking about like this submersible story, right? Like, I was talking to a few friends earlier, and there was a graphic that just showed like how deep 20 miles is, right? That additional context, right? Like, I don't know, is that higher than an airplane flies, right? Or is it deeper than a whale swims, right? And those kinds of perspectives that you're able to offer your audience, right, on a podcast. And picking, a lot of times what I like to do is just pick one thing out of that story, that larger story. Like, we're talking about police killings, but how do we know, like, how we cite these numbers about how many people police kill? How do we know, like, what's the reporting mechanism of police killing? It turns out there isn't one. So something that offers that context about a larger story is valuable to listeners who are interested in the larger story.
nearing the end of our time, so I want to take one more question from the audience, and we'll wrap it up with a final question and closing thoughts. We'll go a few minutes over, just because we have so many amazing questions from you all. I did want to ask about what's happening in the industry right now. We've got a question from the audience to have you all speak just a bit about the layoffs in the podcast industry and how you survived it and what you make of it. I know we could go all day, but we'll try to keep the comments somewhat short.
I think it's just helpful to contextualize it in some ways. Again, I mentioned I cover media, and there's actually layoffs across the media industry writ large. So I don't think it's anything unique or specific to podcasts. And a lot of that is, attributed to a decline in ad revenue, which again, it's across the media space, and some trepidation about the direction of the economy. And so I think that's something that, podcasting is not immune to that. And as was mentioned, it is a medium that does, if you're doing it well, it can take a lot of resources to do. So I think it's just helpful to also think of it in that way as well. Obviously, as it happens, it's devastating for those people who are losing their jobs. But we've also seen the media industry go through this sort of turmoil, ups and downs over the past 2 decades.
One thing I would certainly note is that I think that we're all learning a lot as an industry. Like it's important to remember that podcasting hasn't been around that long, and there's a lot of experimentation that is happening. So things like having shows that are exclusive to one platform, having like big talent that's exclusive to one platform, may be an experiment that some platforms made a big bet on and found that that wasn't a strategy that necessarily is going to work for them for the future. And they tried it and it didn't work out. And I feel like those kind of experiments get a lot of press and a lot of attention because they tend to have a big dollar sign around them and a big, usually big talent attached. But those type of experiments happen in every industry when they're new. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it really speaks much to the health of the industry as a whole. And when you go back to Kat's data about how many people are listening to podcasts, it doesn't change that picture. Michael started us off by mentioning something that I think is so critical to remember here, which is that many of the companies that are experiencing challenges and reorgs right now are companies that are not exclusively podcast companies. They make other stuff too. They are music companies first and foremost, or they are some kind of other media company, and they're trying to figure out how podcasting fits into the mix. And they haven't quite figured it out yet. It's a totally new business model that they're bolting on to their existing business. And there's going to be some bumps in that integration. I think that's very normal when you try to add an entirely new vertical to an existing business, especially if it's not your core competency or your only line of business. So I feel like that is one common thread in a lot of the companies that you're seeing have some reorganizations and some challenges right now. Look, we all hate to see it. It is miserable. I feel like the town crier right now. Every time I open a podcast industry newsletter, I have had friends who are affected by this that are so unbelievably talented. And I want all of them to end up finding jobs that are fantastic. Like, this is no fun to watch, but I really do believe that this is not reflecting the health of the podcast industry's future.
And also what we have to understand is that when you look at the kind of configuration of what we're talking about, these layoffs, right? You're talking about legacy media, large, networks and legacy media who built podcast platforms like radio companies, like TV stations, right? And instead of building these nimble organizations where the independent people, they're thriving, what we're seeing is the people who poured a lot of stuff into it to kind of recreate what they've seen before in radio and TV. And like it's kind of seemed just like what we saw in streaming, right? And that kind of downturn, right, is what we're seeing in the podcast industry. So what we're seeing is not the bottom kind of shaving or losing its foothold, but the people who poured so much in at the top, trying to recreate something that wasn't as nimble as what podcast was originally.
I think with that, we have to wrap up. Thank you all so much for spending a few extra minutes of your day with us. Thank you very, very much to all of our panelists. Thank you to Pew Research, and thank you to you all for coming. Thanks for your expert questions, fantastic questions. I wish we could have got to them all, but you can view this presentation online. It will be archived on the Pew Research Center website. And thank you all again so much for your time, for your work, for your research, and hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much.